Hi, I'm zombie apocalypse author Camille Picott. Welcome to the Unabridged Audiobook of Red Virus, Book 1 of Zommunist Invading. If you enjoy the free audiobooks I offer on my channel, please like and subscribe to my channel and tell all your friends. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy the adventure.
Chapter 8. 2 Trucks. Dal had done it. He'd found Lena and gotten her back to the Beetle. It had been a terrifying sprint through the chaos of downtown. He'd had to shoot 2 Russians with his stolen machine gun. They'd almost been hit by those red darts more times than he could count, but they'd made it. He yanked open the passenger side door of the Beetle. "Get in!" he screamed at Lena. She dove past him into the car. Dal slammed the door after her, relief washing over him. Now what? The question pulsed in his brain as Dal jumped into the driver's seat and locked the door. Now what? After leaving the coffee shop, he hadn't thought past getting Lena safely back to his car. Home. Somehow he had to get her home. But how? He stared at the anarchy around him. Soviets were everywhere. The streets were in uproar. Dead bodies were piling up. Cars had smashed into one another, clogging up the road. The Beetle is small. Lena's eyes flicked up and down the street. We can get through. She was right. The Beetle was small. If there was any car that could maneuver the tight streets, it was this one. Lena surprised him by leaning over and hefting the machine gun that lay across Dal's lap. He grabbed her hand to stop her from taking the weapon. "What are you doing?" It was impossible not to imagine Mr. Cecchino's face if he saw his daughter wielding a Soviet machine gun. Lena gave Dal a look before yanking the gun out of his hands. "I'm going to shoot any Russian that tries to stand in our way." "You don't know how to use a machine gun," he protested. Her gaze was scathing. "You never used one until a few minutes ago, but you did all right." Lena knew her way around guns. Mr. Cecchino had taken her hunting with his sons plenty of times. Still, there was something disturbing about seeing the ex-ballerina hefting the machine gun in her lithe arms. "You don't have to be the knight in shining armor, Dal. It's going to take 2 of us to make it out of Rossi." She rolled down the window, propping the machine gun on the ledge. "Give me those extra magazines." Dal had swiped 2 .45-round mags off the bodies of a Soviet. Lips tight, he passed them to her. "Put your seatbelt on," she huffed. "Okay, Dad." She buckled the belt. "Drive. Get us out of here." "Fuck me," Dal growled. Worry for Lena made him sick, but he fired up the Blue Beetle and rolled forward. The freeway on-ramp. That's where they had to go. From there, it was a straight shot to the country road that led to the farm. The on-ramp was no more than 8 blocks away. They just had to get there. He weaved through the traffic. There were plenty of people still trying to drive, which made the road even more hazardous. Ahead of them, 2 Russians chased several teenage kids down the sidewalk, firing darts at them. "Lena!" she fired. The recoil of the machine gun punched her back into the chair. The bullets went wide and shattered an office window. "Damn it," she muttered. Dal swerved around 2 cars that had crashed into a telephone pole. Lena adjusted her stance, waited for Dal to clear the wrecked cars, then fired again. Her bullets ripped into the men, felling them like rag dolls. The kids fled, racing away down the street. Dal knew Lena was a good shot, but it was one thing to see her shoot a deer, and another thing to see her gun down Soviet invaders. What would Mr. Cecchino say when he found out? Lena leaned back, satisfaction on her face. until she caught Dal looking at her. "Don't worry," she said. "I won't tell Dad." This statement didn't make Dal feel any better. But it wasn't just the mental image of Mr. Cecchino's horror when he learned his daughter had gunned down Russians that made him uncomfortable. It was the realization that Lena looked pretty damn beautiful gunning down enemy soldiers. It wasn't that he was blind. He knew Lena was a beauty. Dal just didn't allow himself to look at her that way. He would never disrespect the family that had taken him in by doing that. She was practically his little sister. Mouth dry, he refocused on the road. A bullet glanced across the roof of the bug. A Russian ran through a drugstore parking lot on Dal's side of the street, firing at the beetle. Lena didn't hesitate. She ejected the seatbelt buckle and hopped up, sticking her torso out the open window. She rotated in the direction of the Russian and delivered a string of answering bullets. The man fell. "I wish Mom was here to see this." Lena dropped back into the car, dark hair in disarray around her face. She always knew this day would come. Dal had no words. He swallowed and kept driving. They made it a few more blocks, moving away from downtown. The road had cleared. The concentration of the attack centered in the heart of Rossi. Only another 2 blocks to the on-ramp. "There's 3 more." Lena settled the machine gun against her shoulder, aiming the barrel out the window. "We can get them. Turn right at the next street." He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Turning right would take them away from the freeway. He ignored her instruction and drove straight through the intersection. "Dal!" He ignored her. "Dal, what the hell? We could have gotten them. 3 less Russians on the loose." "I'm not risking your life so you can gun down Russians," he snapped. "But it's our duty," she argued. "They're on American soil." "It's not your duty," he replied. "And my duty is to get you home to your dad." If she wanted to fight Russians, she could clear it with Mr. Cecchino. "Chauvinist," she muttered. Dal let the comment slide. He was all for equal rights, but not at the risk of getting Lena killed. She could take up the equal rights debate with Mr. Cecchino after Dal got her home in one piece. The freeway on-ramp finally appeared. They were no more than 100 yards away when a blue Mustang shot out from an adjoining street. Dal slammed on the brakes to keep from crashing into the side of the car, halting in the middle of the road. He had just enough time to register the military fatigues. "Out!" Lena screamed. She threw open her door and rolled out of the car. Dal followed suit, punching his seatbelt buckle. He hit the asphalt just as machine gun fire ripped into the beetle. He heard Lena screaming from the other side of the car as she returned fire. Was the girl completely out of her mind? Bullets sprayed his beloved car. Steam hissed out of the back, telling him the engine had been hit. He rolled to a stop, only to find Lena squaring off against the Russians, machine gun on her shoulder. He grabbed her around the waist. The beetle had rolled to a stop in the middle of the road, spewing steam. It wasn't much in the way of cover, but it was the best to be found. He dragged a protesting Lena behind the back fender. "Dal, what the hell?" He yanked the gun out of her hands. "Stay down," he snapped. He made a mental note to make her drive, if they were lucky enough to get a chance to drive out of here. No more guns for Lena. He checked the magazine. 2 bullets left. "Where are the other magazines?" "Here." Lena passed him one. The remaining one was in the waistline of her stretch pants. He wished she was dressed head to toe in Kevlar. The Russians remained inside their Mustang in the middle of the intersection, guns aimed in at them. A car appeared, roaring toward the intersection. It was on a direct intersect course with the Mustang fender. Dal recognized it instantly. He would know the beat-up front end of that brown Chevy pickup anywhere. It was his father's car. Richard Granger sat behind the wheel, his favorite black hat pulled over shaggy hair. He looked just like he did a year ago when Dal had seen him at the cider mill. Mr. Granger drove the truck like an avenging demon. Even though they were separated by more than 100 yards, Dal felt the moment when his father saw him. The sensation was like a spear going through his body. And just like last year at the cider mill, there was a brief moment when father and son looked at each other. It lasted no more than a second, but it felt like centuries. Then Mr. Granger jerked the steering wheel. His truck made a hard right. He zoomed past the Mustang and onto the freeway on-ramp, leaving Dal and Lena in the crosshairs of the Russians. Dal felt his breath leave his body. His father had left him to fend for himself, just like he always had. It hurt. Even after all these years, it still hurt. Dal's mouth tightened. Peering around the side of the Beetle, he spotted one of the Russians. That '69 Mustang Fastback was too fine of a vehicle for Russian scum. The one in the back had his gun propped in the open window. Dal took aim, pretending the Russian was nothing more than a big buck. He fired. The bullets tore through their attacker. The invader slumped, gun clattering to the pavement just outside the Mustang. Dal felt Lena tense beside him. "Don't even think about it. That's a perfectly good weapon. And that's a perfectly good Russian in the driver's seat." Dal slapped in a new magazine as the Russian in the front seat opened fire. He sprayed bullets all around the Beetle. Dal threw himself over Lena, covering her body with his. For once, she didn't fight him. She was too busy screaming as gunfire rained down on them. Dal felt a sting across his shoulder blade. He sucked in a breath at the hot pain that ripped across his back. Dal, are you okay?" He didn't respond, instead gritting his teeth. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a tiny trickle of blood. A graze, not a gunshot wound. "Dal, I'm okay." The gunfire ceased. He heard the door of the Mustang swing open. Boots crunched on broken glass. Dal rolled off Lena and peered beneath the Beetle. The boots of the Russian continued on a trajectory straight for them. Dal fired at the attacker's feet. The invader went down. More gunfire spewed through the air. Dal crawled sideways, poked the gun around the front bumper of the Beetle, and fired in the general direction of the Russian. The machine gun vibrated into his shoulder socket. Silence. He glanced over his shoulder to check on Lena. She was still flat on the pavement, watching him with wide eyes. Drawing a breath, he peeked over the top of the car. The Russian lay dead before him, sprawled in a puddle of his own blood in the middle of the road. Their immediate surroundings were eerily quiet. In the distance was the wail of sirens and machine gun chatter. Lena was the first to move. She darted to the Mustang, snatched up a second machine gun, and slung it around her neck. "I should have grabbed one of these earlier." She opened the driver's side door and popped the seat forward. Grabbing the dead Russian's belt, she dragged the body out of the car. "Come on, let's go." She jerked a thumb at the Mustang and simultaneously grabbed the extra magazines off the dead Russian. Dal took one last look at his smoking Beetle. The Mustang was a superb car in all arenas. Still, he loved his beat-up blue bug. "Dal!" Lena was by his side, squeezing his arm. She knew what the car meant to him. He felt it in the gentle pressure of her fingers. He turned his back on the Beetle. Taking a page out of Lena's book, he grabbed the machine gun and magazines from the Russian he'd killed. He paused, observing the dart gun strapped to the man's waist. Dozens of tiny red darts lined the magazine. "What do you think those are for?" he asked. Lena shook her head. "Soviet poison. Don't touch them." She tugged on his sleeve. "Let's get out of here, Dal." He spun on his heel, running for the car. Lena beat him to the driver's seat. He expected her to move over and let him drive, but she slammed the door and buckled herself in. Shit. Apparently she planned to drive. Dal didn't like it, but arguing would only cost them time. They had to get back to the farm. He barely got the door closed when Lena floored it. He was slammed backward into the seat as she peeled up the on-ramp. They hit the freeway just as a Volvo station wagon sped past with 3 Russians inside. 2 invaders hung out the windows, spraying bullets across traffic. Lena screamed, but her grip on the steering wheel never wavered, not even when a bullet pinged off the front hood. She downshifted and slowed down, letting the Russians get ahead of them. "What the hell?" Dal watched the Russians weave in and out of traffic. One car spun off the road, another barreled across the margin and smashed into oncoming traffic. "They're everywhere." How were they going to get home? "Mayhem and death," Lena replied, swerving around a car that was going even slower than they were. "What?" "I heard the Russians say it. Reap death and mayhem. Those are their orders." "You heard them say it?" "Yeah. They're using the machine guns for death and the darts for mayhem." Dal ground his teeth. "They're doing a damn fine job on both accounts." Dal took in Lena's profile. All he wanted to do was shield her from whatever was going to come. Thank God she hadn't been hit with one of those darts. Ahead of them, the Russians in the station wagon had disappeared around a bend of trees. Not good. The last thing they needed was to drive into an ambush. "Take the next exit," he said. "We can take frontage roads." He broke off at the sight of a familiar blue pickup that zoomed past them on the southbound lane. The vehicle was moving so fast that it was no more than a blur in his periphery. Even so, Dal would know the truck anywhere. After all, Leo had driven him to school in their junior and senior years. Just as the realization hit him, Lena screamed, "Dad!" Dal turned in the seat, staring in horror. There was a long moment when time slowed. Mr. Cecchino and Leo's blue pickup were suspended in a droplet of time, perfectly framed between a wrecked Datsun and a speeding Corvette. A mere 100 yards separated them from him. And then he was gone, the blue bumper disappearing down an off-ramp. What were the odds that both fathers would pass them by in a matter of minutes? One left them to die, while the other drove into the eye of the storm. "What's he doing?" Lena gasped. "What?" "He's looking for you," Dal said. Mr. Cecchino had come all the way to Rossi to find Lena. Of course he had. Dal cursed himself for not thinking of it sooner. He should have tried to call. If he had just thought to find a payphone, he could have called the Cecchino house. Lena made a hard left, the Mustang veering off the road and into the middle divide. "Lena! Shut up, Dal! We're going after him!" The Mustang bumped over the dried, rutted grass of the margin before hitting the road on the other side. A car honked as it flew by, narrowly missing the front end. Dal knew without a doubt that Mr. Cecchino would want him to get Lena to safety. He would not want his daughter coming after him. He searched for words to convince Lena to turn around. He opened his mouth. "Save it, Dal," Lena ground out. "I'm not losing Dad." He heard what was left unsaid. Lena had already lost her mom. She was hell-bent on saving her dad. Lena tore toward the off-ramp her father had taken, swerving around cars in her haste. More cars honked as Lena cut them off. Dal resolved to do everything within his power to protect Lena, even if that meant jumping in front of a machine gun to do it. He'd help her find Mr. Cecchino, and he'd keep Lena alive, whatever it took. Chapter 9. Streets of Rossi. Lena increased pressure on the accelerator, speeding through the streets. There were so many people fleeing town that quite a few cars had moved into the oncoming lane. Her lane. Dell gripped the seat as she laid into the horn and swerved around a car. "Stay in your own lane, asshole!" she yelled out the open window. "Damn it, Lena, save your energy for driving." "Like you didn't think he was an asshole," she shot back. Shit!" Dal leaned out his window, nestling the machine gun against his shoulder. There were 3 Soviets perched on top of a convenience store, firing into the traffic of an oncoming intersection. Brakes squealed. Horns blared. Several cars had already crashed. Dal would never brag, but he was a damn good shot. He'd taken down wild pigs running downhill through the forest on Cecchino land. He sighted down the barrel at the closest of the invaders. 2 shots. The Russian fell. He sighted a second time. Another 2 shots. Another Russian fell. "Nice," Lena breathed. As she tore through the intersection, Dal got off one last shot. He missed the chest of the Soviet, but his bullet hit the guy in the leg. That would do. With any luck, he'd bleed out. The Mustang rumbled loudly down the road. Dal felt it was like a giant beacon alerting everyone to their presence. He wished he could have stolen a quieter car. Not that VW Beetles were known for quiet engines. They neared the building of the local radio station where Dal worked as a janitor at night. As Lena raced toward the buildings, he felt as though he were moving through 2 realities. There was the reality of this morning, where he'd been focused on his studies and determined to figure out a way to leverage his janitorial position into an internship at the radio station. Then there was the reality of now, in which he was driving through a war zone. The sidewalks and road were littered with bodies and wrecked cars. The 2 worlds meshed in his brain in a swirl of color. He suddenly found it hard to breathe. Or maybe it was the sight of Leo's blue truck lying on its side in the middle of the road that stole his breath away. Lena slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the Mustang. Dal was right on her heels. "Dad?" Lena tore around the side of the car with no thought of her own safety. Dal followed, machine gun braced against his shoulder. He scanned the surrounding buildings and cars much the way he would scan the forest for a moving animal. The interior of the car was empty. Dal wasn't sure whether to be relieved or panicked. At least Mr. Cecchino is still alive, he told himself. Alive and missing was better than found and dead. "We have to find him," Lena said. "If he's looking for me, he'll head to the downtown plaza." Okay. He wanted to find Mr. Cecchino as much as Lena did. "We should go on foot. The Mustang draws too much attention. Besides, it would make a better getaway vehicle if they didn't crash it or get the tires shot out. Better to leave it behind for now." Lena nodded in agreement. "Let's go." The street was quiet. A family of 5 scurried past them on the opposite side of the street. The father had a baby strapped to his chest. The mom had 2 toddlers in a stroller, pushing them at a slow run. He and Lena stopped when they reached the next street corner. The plaza, where the nuke rally had been, was 3 blocks east of them. That's where Mr. Cecchino would be headed. Directly across the street from them was the radio station where Dal worked. Many of the windows had been shot out. It was eerie to think that he was scheduled to clean the building that evening. They peeked around the corner. Soviets patrolled the street. Dal watched as more than a dozen people were herded into a tight group. As they watched, the Soviets fired darts into everyone. People screamed under the onslaught. He dropped back behind the corner with Lena. When she pressed her back against him, he sensed her fear. He squeezed her shoulder with his free hand. "I have an idea," he whispered. "Think you could make it to the radio station over there?" He pointed across the street. "To the radio station? Yeah, I know my way around the building. One of the perks of being a janitor. I can get us through there. It will get us 2 blocks closer to the plaza without being in the open." Lena nodded eagerly. "Good idea." When they peered around the corner a second time, they were greeted with an odd sight. The group of people who had been shot with darts were now free. They raced down the street while the Soviets shouted after them and fired their weapons into the air. It made no sense. Why were they firing into the air? They could mow down that entire group with a few sprays of their machine guns. The answer was simple. Whatever poison was in those darts was being dispersed throughout the city. Dal decided he couldn't worry about that right now. What mattered was the fact that he and Lena had a dozen people between them and the Russians. What mattered was that Mr. Cecchino was probably in the plaza looking for Lena. Heart pounding, he grabbed Lena's hand and sprinted in front of the fleeing people. As soon as they hit the sidewalk on the other side, Dal leapt through the shattered glass of the radio station's front door. His grip on Lena's hand never slacked. She jumped through after him. As they landed inside the building, the group of terrified people raced past them. They split off in different directions. Inside the station, the only sound was Dal and Lena's harsh breathing. Dal dropped Lena's hand and gripped his gun in both hands. "This way." The door behind the reception desk was unlocked. Normally, a person needed an employee badge or an appointment to get through that door. Now, it was wide open. "Stay behind me," he said to Lena. For once, she didn't argue with him, although she did shoulder the machine gun like she meant to blast anything that so much as twitched. All the lights were on, but the station was deserted. They entered an open-ceilinged area lined with office cubicles. In the middle of the floor was an overturned microwave lunch. He stepped over raviolis. A chair sat in the middle of an aisle, tipped over on its side. Someone had left a purse with all its makeup sitting in the middle of a desk where anyone could go through it. There was a shattered glass of milk farther down the aisle. Dal and Lena crept through the cubicle area and came to the hallway that led to the executive suites. The door was wide open. A single high-heel shoe lay in the hallway beyond. That undoubtedly belonged to Sue, the executive assistant of the station's president. It was only yesterday that Dal had been working out ways to accidentally bump into the president so as to introduce himself. Past the executive offices was another door that led to the broadcasting room. This was the place Dal really itched to be. He always envisioned himself behind the morning show microphone. That was the sole reason he'd taken the janitorial job at the radio station. Well, that and because he needed cash to pay for gas and school books. Steady noise vibrated the doors that led to the broadcasting room. Dal recognized the sound immediately. It was the blare of the emergency broadcast system. The sound sent a shiver through him. Machine gun ready, he eased the door open. The sound drilled into his ears. There was no message playing, just the unending whine that indicated an emergency. He supposed they didn't have a pre-recorded message for a Russian invasion. Everyone had left in the middle of work. Like the office cubicles, There were signs of a hasty exit. Car keys on the floor, a half-eaten sandwich. An idea formed in his mind. People needed to know what was happening. He glanced over his shoulder at Lena and flicked his eyes at the studio. She nodded in understanding. He led the way into the room, locking the door behind them. He made his way to a wide bank of buttons and switches, his fingers caressing the microphone that dangled from a thick cable down from the ceiling. Sometimes, when he picked apples under the sweltering sun, he escaped the discomfort by imagining himself as a radio DJ. He'd play good music and help people escape the stress of their day. He'd make sure to play every request phoned in. And he'd find local, uplifting stories to share on the airwaves. Amidst the abandoned studio, this dream seemed a million miles away. Dal let the machine gun dangle from its strap around his shoulder. His fingers flipped the various switches and buttons while Lena stood guard behind him. Thank God he'd taken a radio communications class at the junior college. Otherwise, he'd have no idea how to use the equipment. He leaned into the microphone. Making a snap decision, he didn't use his name in case the Soviets had a way to track him. I'm broadcasting live from KZSQ in Rossheed, California. West County is under attack by Soviet forces. Repeat, West County, California is under attack by Soviet forces. He licked his lips and glanced at Lena. At her encouraging nod, he turned back to the microphone. Russians arrived in Greyhound buses barely an hour ago. They're dressed in fatigues with the Soviet star, sickle and hammer on the back. Many of them have machine guns, but they're also armed with dart guns. They're shooting people with darts. At this time, it is unknown what substance is in the darts. Avoid the Russians at all costs. Use extreme caution if leaving the area. If you have the means, board up your doors and windows. Keep your guns loaded. Protect your families. And then, because he couldn't help himself, he decided to end on a positive note. America isn't going to stand for this shit. Kill any communist bastard you see. His finger slammed down, looping the recording to play over and over. A grin split Lena's face. She gave him the thumbs up. Take that, fuckers, Dal mumbled. Something loud banged nearby. It sounded like a door. Fear spiked through Dal. He grabbed Lena's hand and yanked her out of the recording studio. Another door slammed, then another. Through the open door of the executive wing, he saw a flash of camouflage green. Soviets. They'd heard his broadcast. They had to get out of here. Chapter 10. Radio Station. Dal shoved Lena in front of him. Run, he hissed. She broke into a blind run, sprinting as fast as she could out the door and into the adjoining hall. Dal was on her heels. He counted the bangs as the Russians checked each of the executive offices. They didn't know where the studio was and weren't taking any chances. 4 doors. 5, 6. He spun around and raised his Russian-issued machine gun. The corridor door flew open. Dal opened fire, spraying bullets down the hall, then turned and ran. Shouts and Russian gibberish followed. Right, he hissed at Lena as they approached a fork in the corridor. She tore right. Dal followed. Behind them came shouting and more gunfire. Shit. He was going to get Lena killed if he didn't think of something. Left, he whisper-shouted. Lena made the turn without question. The janitorial closet appeared up ahead on their right. An idea formed in Dal's mind. His left hand reached out to snag Lena's shirt. His right hand plunged into the pocket of his jeans. He pulled out his keys to the KZSQ janitorial supply closet. Just as he shoved the key into the lock, a Russian burst around the corner. At the sight of them, the soldier shouted in alarm. Lena was ready for him. She let loose a burst of bullets just as Dal yanked open the door. The soldier fell as Dal hauled her inside and quietly closed the door. Their harsh breathing filled the large closet. He didn't dare turn on the lights. He closed his eyes, imagining the closet he knew so well. The toilet paper and paper towels were stacked on the right-hand side. The bleach and disinfectant were stored on the left. At the back of the room were miscellaneous supplies like Kleenex and toilet seat covers. And in the back left-hand corner was Dal's cleaning cart. He snagged at Lena, his hand catching the sleeve of her shirt. He pulled the cart out of the corner, thankful he'd gone to the trouble of oiling the wheels last week. He felt around on the floor until he found what he was looking for, the subfloor access panel. Dal had used the access panel several times. The studio had intermittent rodent problems, and Dal was the one drafted to set up the traps underneath the building. He was the same one who cleaned them up, too. On the side of the cleaning cart was the apron he wore. Inside was a slender mag light. He grabbed it and switched it on as he opened the access panel. He gestured to the black hole in the floor. Lena set her lips and dropped through the opening. Dal had to hand it to her. She didn't balk or flutter like most girls would. She went right in and disappeared from sight. Shouting sounded from the hall, followed by footsteps. Dal jumped into the hole and pulled the cart back to block it from sight. He dropped the panel into place just as the door to the closet burst open. The flashlight illuminated Lena's wide eyes. Her hands shook. The sight made his stomach clench. Here he had set out to protect her. Then he'd gone and made that broadcast. He'd pretty much let all the invaders know where they were. He'd put her smack in the middle of danger. Stupid, stupid! Now he had to get her the hell out of here. He shifted the flashlight, aiming it toward the east side of the building. The plaza was east. That's where they'd find Mr. Cecchino. A loud bang sounded above him, followed by Russian cursing. Someone had overturned one of the supply racks. He started to crawl when Lena gripped his shoulder. Her eyes were fixed on the floor above them. Two more Russians spoke rapidly. Lena cocked her head. It took Dal a moment to realize she was listening to them. No, it was more than just that. She was translating them. The Russians left, the janitorial closet banging shut behind them. Could you understand what they were saying? Dal was doubtful as to how much Russian military jargon Lena might have picked up on her mom's tapes. She pursed her lips. They said they're taking over all communication buildings. They plan to control all TV and radio channels. Really? He was impressed despite himself. You really heard that? She poked him in the ribs. Duh. You see me listening to those tapes. Did you think I was zoning out when I had my headphones on? He thought she was hanging on to the memory of her mom, though he didn't say that. What else did they say? She shook her head. That's all I heard. The army crawled their way through the subfloor. It was dry and musty. Occasionally, dust and grit showered down any time someone above them moved. Cobwebs clung to the wood support beams. Lena wasn't a fan of spiders, but she showed no sign of distress as they crawled past them. Maybe coming face to face with Russian invaders was enough to cure a person of spider phobia. Maybe. Snap. Dal bit down on a howl of pain. He writhed on the ground, the flashlight rolling from his hand. A mousetrap. He put his hand in a fucking mousetrap. A mousetrap he had set. Lena scrambled toward his flopping hand. Relief flooded his body as she pulled it free. He lay limp on the ground, panting from the pain. "Are you okay?" Lena's words were the softest whisper. He nodded, taking in big gulps of air. He was wasting time. They had to keep moving. They had to find Mr. Cecchino. They resumed their crawl. Lena carried the flashlight this time. She swept it back and forth over the ground, the narrow beam picking out the mousetraps. A few of them had carcasses in them. It had been Dal's plan to clean the traps next week. They reached the end of the studio building. All told, the studio itself was 2 blocks long. That meant the plaza was only 1 block away. He and Lena lay side by side, staring through the small grill that led out into an alleyway. It was a small opening. Lena would be able to shimmy through it, but Dal wasn't sure he could. "Look over there," she pointed. On the other side of the alleyway was the Cantina, a Mexican restaurant that bordered the plaza. His eyes picked out the grate that led to the subfloor of the restaurant. "If we can get under the Cantina, we'll have a clear view of the plaza," Lena whispered. Dal wasn't sure he'd fit through the grate under the radio station, let alone the one under the Cantina. As he lay there considering their options, a flood of black boots and fatigues streamed past them, all headed in the direction of the plaza. Dal and Lena instinctively backed away from the grill. There were dozens upon dozens of Russians. And they weren't alone. They herded dozens and dozens of Americans along at gunpoint, shouting at them in their rough language. Dal angled his head, trying to get a better look at the people who were forced by them. He recognized a few kids he'd seen around the junior college. He even spotted Sue, the executive assistant to the KZSQ studio president. She limped along with only one heeled shoe, her other foot bare on the pavement. And there was the station president, dragging an injured leg as the Russians prodded him forward. Lena sucked in a breath. He knew from the sound what she had seen, or rather, who she had seen. His eyes sorted through the many feet streaming past the grill, searching for the familiar pair of brown leather work boots. He knew those shoes as well as he knew his own. There, the worn leather boots with a piece of rotted apple clinging to the side of the sole. Mr. Cecchino. Under Soviet gunpoint, he disappeared around the corner into the plaza. Chapter 11. Inoculation. "Dad!" Lena's agonized whisper washed over him. Dal felt panic overtake him. He waited for the flood of footsteps to pass. As soon as the Russians and their captives disappeared around the corner, he counted to 20. When no one else appeared in the alley, he yanked off the grate. Lena tried to wiggle past him, but he refused to let her pass. He attempted to angle his body into the opening, but it was no use. His shoulders were too wide. He checked the street again. There was no one in sight. The noise coming from the plaza was loud. There was shouting in both English and Russian, as well as gunfire. It was the gunfire that made him reckless. He spun around on his back and braced his hands against a support beam. Then he rammed the heels of his Converse into the wood directly next to the opening. It took 5 good kicks before the wood splintered. Dal cleared away the debris with his foot. When he was finished, there was a jagged gash next to the grate opening. It was now wide enough for him. He flipped over and crawled out head first. He crouched in the street, scanning the area as Lena wiggled out beside him. More gunfire ripped up from the plaza. Blood beat in his temples. Worry made it hard to breathe. He couldn't get Mr. Cecchino's face out of his head. Lena grabbed his hand. They crept to the far end of the alleyway and peered around the corner. They had a clear view of Rossi's downtown plaza. It was the size of a city block. In the center was a large fountain with benches interspersed around it. A series of sidewalks stretched out from the fountain like the arms of a star. Triangle wedges of grass filled the area between the walkways. The plaza was used for many things: 4th of July celebrations, multicultural events like Chinese New Year and Cinco de Mayo, music festivals, even anti-nuke rallies. Today, it was surrounded by a solid wall of fatigues emblazoned with the red star, sickle, and hammer. The Russians hemmed in several hundred people. Dal expected to see them firing their guns into the innocent crowd. He expected to see a slaughterhouse. Instead, the Soviets discharged their weapons into the open air, laughing and shouting as they did so. It was hard to see past the thick ring of invaders, but Dal was tall enough to glimpse inside. He saw the bodies of Americans crushed together in fear. Mr. Cecchino was in there somewhere, but it was impossible to pick him out. "They keep shouting, 'Death and mayhem,'" Lena whispered. "Can you see what they're doing?" Dal shook his head, feeling helpless. He wanted to charge in there and find Mr. Cecchino, but that would only get him shot, either with a bullet or a red dart. "Let's try and get a better look." Lena jerked her thumb at the cantina. They backed away from the street corner. Like the news station, many of the windows had been shot out of the Mexican restaurant. A large window that led into the bar lay open to the street. Lena was tall and lean. She slipped easily through the jagged opening. Dal sucked in his rib cage before following her. He knocked a few shards of glass free with his chest, but the sound was lost in the roar of the machine gun fire. They crept through the bar, making their way to the east side of the restaurant for a better look into the plaza. Margarita glasses were smashed on the floor. Someone had dropped a burrito and stepped on it. They paused at the host stand. Dal strained his ears. "Do you hear that?" he asked in a soft voice. Lena nodded. She heard it too. Russian voices coming from somewhere above them. "The owners live on top of the restaurant," Lena said. "The Russians must have found a way up there." Dal's first instinct was to get Lena the hell out of the cantina. But they'd have no chance of finding Mr. Cecchino if they ran now. He peeked around the corner into the main dining room, where there was a wall of solid glass that gave them a clear view of the plaza. Only 2 of the large windows had been shot out. The rest stood intact. An abandoned plate of enchiladas sat untouched on a table. "Over there," he pointed to the stage at the back of the room. Live bands performed there on the weekends. The stage was stacked with several large speakers, all of them big enough to hide behind. Lena nodded. Crouching low, they scurried through the dining room, hopped onto the stage, and hid behind the speakers. They now had a front row seat to everything happening in the plaza. The gunfire had died in the last 30 seconds. Frightened murmuring had fallen over the gathered prisoners. Dal spotted dead bodies on the ground outside, along with a great deal of blood. The sight made his stomach clench. There were overturned tables from the anti-nuke rally and poster boards trampled underfoot. No doubt the Soviets had swept through here in the initial attack. The fact that Lena had escaped seemed like a miracle. She could have easily been one of the dead out there. As the thought came to him, he realized he had his arm around her. He tightened his grip protectively, relieved when she didn't pull away. "American swine," a thickly accented voice projected across the crowd. Someone spoke through a megaphone, possibly one of the megaphones that had been used in the anti-nuke rally. "This is now Russian soil. You are guests in a foreign nation. All guests must be inoculated." At the word inoculated, the Russian soldiers lifted their dart guns. The sight of red darts resting in large cartridges filled Dal with dread. They had to find out what the hell was in those things. The people screamed as the Russians began firing darts into the mass. Lena's hands latched around Dal's upper arm, gripping him so fiercely he knew she'd leave bruises. The shooting lasted for what seemed like hours. In truth, it was no more than 5 minutes. "Return to your homes," boomed the voice through the megaphone. "Tell your family and your neighbors that you all now reside on Russian soil. Spread the word, comrades." In a synchronized movement, the Soviets dispersed, breaking the solid wall they'd made with their bodies. They moved into the crowd, firing their darts as people fled. "They are letting them go?" A dent marred Lena's brow. "That doesn't make any sense." "It does if they want to spread mayhem," Dal replied. "Or disease." Booming laughter drifted through the dining room. Dal's muscles went rigid with fear. The voice came from inside the cantina. The distinct thud of boots on wooden stairs accompanied the laughter. The Russians on the second floor. They were coming downstairs. His eyes darted, gauging their chances of making it across the dining room and out one of the busted windows. They might be able to make it, but there were Soviets just outside. He didn't want to risk getting shot with the darts. Lena, still with a death grip on his arm, yanked him sideways. They sank up against the wall in the shadow of the speakers. Boots crunched on broken glass. Dal glimpsed the flash of several uniforms as Russians entered the dining room. His hands flexed around his stolen machine gun. He didn't like the odds of trying to shoot their way free, but if that was their only option, he wouldn't hesitate. The same voice from the megaphone spoke, filling the room with a deep baritone. He sounded like he spoke with a megaphone even when he didn't have one. Dal realized he must have been addressing the crowd from the second floor of the restaurant. "He's asking for a drink," Lena whispered in his ear. Dal blinked, once again impressed that she could understand the words so well. There was more talk from the dining room and the scurrying of boots. Dal tried to focus on the words. He kept hearing the word "Nezhet." Lena's eyes were unfocused as she listened. Her lips moved without sound as the Russians conversed. Glasses clinked like they were toasting their success. Laughter followed. The sound made Dal's blood boil. He'd never considered joining the military, but at that moment he would have signed his name on enlistment papers with his own blood. Dal tracked the sound of boots on broken glass. Someone moved in their direction. To his horror, one of the communist bastards sat on the edge of the stage. The boards creaked under the soldier's weight. Dal risked a glimpse around the edge of the speaker with one eye. Lena yanked him back, but not before he caught sight of the broad back displaying the red star, sickle, and hammer. All he wanted to do was lay into the bastard with his machine gun. Only Lena kept him in check. He couldn't do anything that would put her in jeopardy. The Russians talked for a few more minutes, laughing and enjoying their drinks. And then they left. 1 second they were there, the next they dropped empty glasses onto a table and strode out. Dal listened to the sound of their footsteps recede, then disappear altogether. He and Lena remained where they were, frozen in place. "You okay?" He gave her a soft squeeze. Lena ignored him. "Nezhit." She said the word several times to herself, as though tasting it on her tongue. "What does it mean?" Dal asked. Of all the things the Russians had said, it was the only word that stuck in his brain. Something in the way they had said it made his skin crawl. She shook her head. "I don't know. I need my Russian dictionary. But it has something to do with the red dart. They called it a virus. A Nezhit virus." "What else did they say?" "You know how those soldiers in the radio station said they're taking over all the radio and TV stations?" "Yeah." "Apparently, they've been tasked with taking over all broadcasting stations on the West Coast." Dal's mouth went dry. "The entire West Coast?" "Yeah." Soviets were famous for their propaganda campaigns. It was a known fact they lied and terrorized their own people. Now they were going to use American broadcast stations to do the same thing here. But the entire West Coast? How widespread was this attack? Were Soviets all over the country or just on the West Coast? What was the government doing? If they were aware of the attack, surely they'd be readying nukes by now. Maybe they'd already fired on Russia. Dal shook himself. He had more immediate concerns. Nukes were definitely above his pay grade. "Come on." He rose slowly, checking the dining room to be sure it was clear. "Let's go find your dad." Chapter 12. Broadcast. "I've got something!" Anton yelled. Leo dropped his box of food on the steps and rushed into the cabin. His little brother crouched in front of the coffee table, fiddling with the dial of their small portable radio. It was the one their father used to listen to baseball games. Up until now, nothing but the monotone blare of the emergency broadcast system sounded on all stations. As Leo charged into the cabin, a familiar voice filled his ears. "I'm broadcasting live from KZSQ in Rossi, California. West County is under attack by Soviet forces. Repeat, West County, California is under attack by Soviet forces. Russians arrived in Greyhound buses. They're dressed in fatigues with the Soviet star, sickle and hammer on the back. Many of them have machine guns, but they're also armed with dart guns. They're shooting people with darts. At this time, it is unknown what substance is in the darts. Avoid the Russians at all costs. Use extreme caution if leaving the area. If you have the means, board up your doors and windows. Keep your guns loaded. Protect your families." A long pause, and then, "America isn't going to stand for this shit. Kill any communist bastard you see." "That's Dallas." Nona stood over the coffee table, pride in her eyes as she stared at the radio. "That's our Dallas." Dal's message was looped. The family listened to it play another 3 times before Bruce came into the cabin with an armload of logs. At the sound of Dal's voice, he nearly tripped in surprise before depositing the firewood next to the wood-burning stove. "Son of a bitch!" Bruce slapped his knee. "Language!" Nona slapped Bruce on the back of the head. "Ow!" Bruce frowned down at the tiny, wrinkled woman who was less than half his size. "No foul language under this roof." "Sorry." Bruce waited for Nona to turn away before he grinned at Leo. "Dal pulled a fast one on the Russian bastards." Leo grinned back. If Dal was alive, he'd be with Lena. The news station was right next to the downtown plaza where Lena had gone for the anti-nuke rally. Somehow, Dal had made it from the junior college campus to the radio station. Lena was safe with him. Leo felt the truth of this in his bones. Dal was with Lena, and his best friend would protect his little sister with his life. That didn't answer the question of where their father was. Thinking of Mr. Cecchino left Leo with a dry mouth. "Dal said all of West County is under attack," Anton said. "Not good. And it sounds like Rossi is overrun, just like Bastopol." "They're okay," Leo said. "They'll be back soon." He had to believe that. Otherwise, he'd lose his fucking mind. With Dal's message playing on repeat on the radio, he returned outside and hefted up a box of cooking supplies. Nona had planned on cooking for 8 full-grown men from San Francisco for 2.5 days, which meant this was the first of many food boxes. "Over here, Leonardo," Nona gestured to the kitchen table. "Let me see what I have to work with. I'll have to change the menu to stretch our supplies." Leo set down the box and unpacked it for his grandmother. He made several more trips to the truck and brought up the remaining food boxes. By the time he was finished, the kitchen table and most of the narrow countertop was filled with food. There were canned tomatoes and other canned vegetables, cartons of eggs and several containers of flour, jars and jars of homemade chicken stock, 2 jars of bacon grease, several loaves of fresh-baked bread, bags of dried beans, fresh slabs of bacon from a pig Mr. Cecchino shot only 2 days ago. There were even several fresh apple pies Nona had baked that afternoon. Fresh balls of pasta dough were tucked into a row of Ziplocs. It looked like a feast. In reality, they had 4 teenage football players in the house, plus Leo. The 5 of them ate like machines. And there would be Dal, Lena, and Mr. Cecchino when they made it back. They'd have to ration. If they were sparing with their food, they might be able to stretch it for 10 days. Leo's family could hunt. Nona knew a lot about the plants in the forest. They might be able to forage for other food if needed. They could sneak back down to the house and grab more supplies if the coast was clear. "This will have to do," Nona announced. Dal's message on the radio abruptly cut off. "What the hell?" Anton shouted at the radio. Static. Then the blare of the emergency broadcast station returned. Leo felt his stomach sink into his feet. He had to remind himself that Dal had looped his message, which meant he probably wasn't in the station when the person who shut off the message showed up. Dal was smart. He'd survived the hell of his childhood. He could survive a few fucking Russians. At least, this is what Leo told himself. It was the only thing keeping him from tearing back down the road and driving to Rossi. "Damn it!" Anton smacked the coffee table in frustration. "Language, Anthony," Nona barked. "I will not have filthy mouths in my house." Leo knew she would have smacked the side of his head if Anton wasn't on the other side of the room. "Sorry, Nona," Anton said automatically. He turned to Leo. "We need to know what's going on out there. One of us should drive back to Bastopol and have a look." It didn't help that these were the very words running through Leo's brain. He knew it was an idiotic idea. They'd barely made it out of Bastopol. But not knowing what the hell was going on was like an itch that couldn't be scratched. Thankfully, it made it easy to shoot down the idea simply because Anton had suggested it. "No," he told his little brother. "No one goes anywhere until Dad gets back with Lena and Dal." "We could ride bikes," Anton began. "That would make it easy to get off the road and hide if—" "No one goes anywhere until Dad gets back with Lena and Dal," Leo repeated. "But, Antony," Nona gave him a fierce look, "there are supplies to bring inside. Now." Anton shot a dark look at Leo before stomping out the front door. "2 more armloads of firewood," Nona told Bruce. "Then you can start a fire." Her eyes narrowed. "You do know how to start a fire?" "Yes, Nona." Bruce ducked back outside. Nona waited until the 2 younger boys disappeared out the door before turning to Leo. "I'm worried about the sick boy," she said in a low voice. "I don't know what the Russian poison is doing to him. His fever is too high. We need a way to cool off his body." "We need ice," Leo said. "There is no ice." Nona pointed to a stack of towels that Anton had dropped onto the sofa. "Take the truck down to the creek with Anton. The water there is always cold. Soak those towels in the water and bring them back. We'll pack the towels around his body." "Okay, Nona." Leo snatched up the stack of towels, grateful for something constructive to do, even if he did have to do it with Anton. At least arguing with his little brother would keep worry at bay until the rest of their family got back to the cabin.
If you're enjoying this series, be sure to check out Jesus Christ, Zombie Killer. This series takes freakishly fast zombies, like you would find in the movie World War Z, and pits them against classic biblical heroes such as John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, and Jesus. Available on Amazon, Kindle Unlimited, and select audiobook retailers. And now, back to the show.
Chapter 13. Detour. Dal and Lena hustled through the streets of Rossi, joining the crowd of people fleeing from the plaza. Most of them were unharmed, except for the dart punctures. The few exposed punctures he saw were red and puckered, some of the skin already edged with black. Dal kept them in the center of the crowd, where they would blend in. He and Lena scanned the people, searching for any sign of Mr. Cecchino. He had to be out here somewhere. Dal's machine gun was hidden under his loose button-up shirt. The butt was beneath his armpit, the barrel tip tucked into the waistline of his jeans. He kept his arm clamped firmly to his side, holding the gun in place. The 2 extra magazines had been shoved into the crotch of his pants. It wouldn't fool any Russian looking closely at him, but lucky for him, they were camouflaged among the hundreds of people fleeing the plaza. Lena tried to conceal her weapon in a similar fashion. She didn't have Dal's height, which meant the barrel hung halfway down her thigh. Her extra magazine was tucked into the waistline of her stretch pants. Luckily, the loose tee she wore concealed most of the gun. He spotted Russians along rooftop buildings, many of them smoking cigarettes and casually watching people stream by below them. There were also Russians on the streets, strolling around in large packs. They let everyone pass unmolested. Dal's shoulders itched as they passed half a dozen Soviets. The men smiled smugly at them, machine guns propped on their shoulders. Cocky bastards. One minute they're shooting at us, and now they're letting us walk away. They're not just letting us walk away, Dal replied. They shot everyone up with whatever is in those darts. He was pretty damn sure it was an illness of some kind, a bacteria or virus cooked up in some underground Red Army lab. Letting everyone go might be as good as shooting them dead. And they'll spread whatever they have, Lena said grimly. Exactly. We have to find my dad. Dal nodded. They passed another group of Soviets. A few of them chuckled at something one of their comrades said. Beside him, Lena stiffened. "What?" he asked. She gave him a tight look but shook her head. He understood. Whatever she'd heard the Russians say, it wasn't safe to repeat here. The crowd steadily dispersed as they went along, people hurrying away in different directions. Dal and Lena hustled up the road that led back to where they had left the Mustang. Dal hoped it was still there. Otherwise, they might be hoofing it back to the farm. "Dal," Lena yanked on his arm. "Look, over there by that orange Datsun." Dal's breath caught in his throat. Bending over to peer into the driver's side window of an orange Datsun was a familiar beat-up brown leather jacket. Mr. Cecchino. In wordless unison, Dal and Lena broke into a run. They were hampered by the guns they concealed under their clothes, but even so they managed. Mr. Cecchino turned just as they reached him. Dal had just enough time to register a wan, dirt-smudged face before Lena threw herself into her father's arms. "Daddy!" Mr. Cecchino's mouth fell open with a gasp of relief. His eyes watered as he held his daughter tight. He rocked her as she wept into his shirt. His eyes met Dal's over Lena's dark head of hair. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He settled for reaching out and giving Dal's shoulder a hard squeeze. Dal returned the shoulder squeeze, his heart brimming. He made it a point not to look directly at the dart marks studding Mr. Cecchino's forearm. They marred the tanned skin just below the rolled-up sleeve of his flannel shirt. The three of them stood like that for a long minute, Lena in her father's embrace, the two men grasping one another's shoulders. Then Mr. Cecchino gently extracted himself from Lena. By this time, his eyes had dried. Dal had watched him deal with grief when Mrs. Cecchino had been diagnosed with cancer. Their small exchange had been as expressive as Mr. Cecchino ever got. "Dallas," Mr. Cecchino at last found his voice. "If anyone could find my Lena, I knew you could." "Don't give him all the credit." Lena flicked her ponytail over one shoulder and wiped her cheeks dry. "I had to hit 2 Soviets with a megaphone when they first attacked. I had to fight off 2 more with a chair leg while I waited for Dal to find me." She smiled at Dal, her eyes shining at him in a way he'd never seen before. "We have a car," Dal said, ignoring the way Lena's smile made his stomach flutter. 2 blocks north of here." "Good." Mr. Cecchino wiped at the sweat that beaded his forehead. A bruise was forming around one eye. "I was considering the wisdom of breaking into this one and hot-wiring it." Dal and Lena exchanged looks. Mr. Cecchino measured them, then shook his head. "Just take me to the car. We have to get back to the farm. I sent Nona and the rest of the family to the cabin. A couple of Anton's teammates were with them." They hurried up the street and arrived unmolested at the Blue Mustang. Mr. Cecchino took in the car with a raised eyebrow as Dal fished the keys out of his pocket. "We took it from some Russians," Lena explained. She slid into the back seat and pulled out her machine gun. "Did you take that from some Russians, too?" Mr. Cecchino raised both brows. "After I shot them, yeah." Despite Mr. Cecchino's skeptical expression, Dal didn't miss the glint of pride in his eye. "Are you okay, honey?" Lena rolled her eyes. "I'd rather shoot a Russian than a deer. At least deer are pretty." Mr. Cecchino cleared his throat, clearly fighting a grin. "Good job, sweetheart. Today you lived up to the family namesake." Dal pulled out his own machine gun after he slid into the driver's seat. He passed the weapon to Mr. Cecchino. "You're officially riding shotgun." Mr. Cecchino took the gun and readied it across his lap. "Gladly, son." Lena snickered as Dal unbuttoned his pants and pulled the extra magazines out of his crotch. Dal angled his head, hoping she didn't notice his blush. It was just as embarrassing as it had been when she watched him stash them in the first place. "Sorry." He grimaced as he set the magazines on the floor by Mr. Cecchino's feet. "I didn't have anywhere else to put them." "Son, you aren't going to see me complain about having extra bullets to kill Russians." Dal fired up the Mustang. By now, there were other cars on the move as more and more people from the plaza made it to their vehicles. Dal scanned the road, looking for fatigue uniforms. He still wasn't sure they would really let them all just leave. He pulled the three-pointer and got the car moving in the direction of the freeway on-ramp. They had only driven a few blocks before Lena spoke. "Dad?" "Yes, honey?" Mr. Cecchino kept his eyes out the window, scanning the road and buildings for any sign of danger. "I have to tell you something." Dal looked at her in the rearview mirror, unease prickling his skin. "What is it?" Lena sucked in a breath. Dal felt the familiar tug of foreboding in his stomach. "The Russians said something." "The Russians said a lot of things, honey." "I mean, when Dal and I were trying to find you, we were walking past a group of them and I overheard something important." Dal felt the breath leave his body. He had a sinking feeling he knew where this conversation was going. He sped up, hurrying toward the freeway. Lena licked her lips. "I overheard one of them. All his friends were laughing." "What did you overhear, Lena?" "The Russians said they'll all be sick within the next 12 hours. Then everyone they know will be sick. Then everyone will be dead and this place will be ours." Dal's blood ran cold. He forced himself not to look at Mr. Cecchino. He'd studied the dart bites on the other man's forearm. There were 4 of them. The wounds were puckered red and black at the edges. No one spoke. The only sound was the roar of the Mustang. "That's not all." Lena's eyes met Dal's briefly in the rearview mirror. She leaned forward, propping her arms on the back seat. "I heard them say they're the first wave. Everyone who volunteered for the first wave gets first choice of property when the stupid Americans are gone." There were going to be more. Dal licked his lips. There were going to be more Russians. Fucking hell. "Stop the car," Mr. Cecchino ordered. "What?" Dal gaped at him, sure he hadn't heard him correctly. "Stop the car." "But—" "Stop the car, Dallas." Dal obediently pulled over. He gripped the steering wheel in silent frustration as cars whizzed past them. "What else did you overhear?" Mr. Cecchino asked his daughter. "They kept using the word nezhet. I think that's the name of the poison they put into the darts. I couldn't understand everything they were saying, but the general context is that there's going to be a lot of dead within the next 12 hours. Mr. Cecchino shifted so that he could look at both Dal and Lena. "This is important information. There aren't a lot of people anywhere who understand Russian. Lena could be one of the very few people who has this information." Oh, shit. Dal knew where this was going. Lena was cut from the same cloth as her father. "This information is too important to go back to the farm with us. We have to get it to the authorities." No one spoke. Dal knew Mr. Cecchino was right. It didn't mean he had to like it. "How?" Lena asked. "They have the radio station. They probably have the police station, too." "What about the other radio stations?" Mr. Cecchino asked. "Or television stations?" "From what I overheard, They're taking all the broadcasting stations up and down the West Coast, Lena said. Television and radio. They've probably done it by now. They likely plan to spread their communist propaganda. There probably isn't an unoccupied station anywhere nearby, Dal said. Then something occurred to him. Unless, maybe, he clamped his mouth shut. Part of him wanted to take the words back. All he wanted was to get Lena and Mr. Cecchino to the cabin, to safety. Unless what? Lena leaned forward. What are you thinking, son? Dal sighed, knowing it was too late to take back his words. The junior college has an amateur radio station, but it doesn't have a wide range. It only broadcasts around campus. But there's a chance the Russians won't know about it. The transmitter is small and portable. If we can get the equipment, if we can find a large antenna, maybe a big TV antenna. The campus station runs on FM waves, same as a TV antenna. A large TV antenna can send out a broadcast to a large area. Brilliant! Mr. Cecchino slapped him on the shoulder. Let's go to the campus and get the transmitter. But... Dal flicked his eyes in Lena's direction, attempting to ask a silent question. Lena snorted. Don't think you can sideline me. Besides, it doesn't make sense to drive all the way back to the farm, then turn around and come back to Rossi. She's right, Mr. Cecchino said. Dal wanted to curse. Of all the Cecchino kids, Lena was the most like her father. All he wanted was to get the two of them to safety. All they wanted to do was run into the lion's den and be heroes. He ran a hand through his shaggy hair. I don't think it's a good idea. The campus was hit hard by the Russians. Even if we could get to the equipment, getting our hands on a large TV antenna isn't going to be easy. We have to try, Lena insisted. This information is too important to keep to ourselves. Damn. How could he argue with that? Let's move the car and get a little closer to campus, Mr. Cecchino said. We can see how things look. If there are too many Soviets, we'll go back to the farm and come up with another plan. But, Lena began, we can't get the information to the authorities if we're dead, Mr. Cecchino said. Dal is right. We have to be cautious. Dal didn't wait for Lena to argue. He threw the car into drive and headed toward the junior college. This was the best way to derail the entire plan. As soon as Mr. Cecchino saw the campus overrun with Soviets, they could give up this crazy idea and get back to the farm. Chapter 14. Domestic Violence. Leo and Anton returned from the creek with soaking wet towels. The fact that they only argued twice was a sign of just how fucked up things were. Leo switched off the truck in front of the cabin and set the parking brake. I'm telling you, Lars needs a doctor, Anton said for the 400th time. Wet towels won't do shit to help him. Since when are wet towels prescribed to fight Russian poison? Leo didn't disagree. If not for Dal's message, Leo would have suggested taking the risk to get Lars to a doctor. If things were as bad as Dal had implied, going to a hospital would be more deadly than staying here. But all he said to Anton was, How do you know what will work and what won't work? Since when are you a doctor? You're such an ass. Anton slammed the truck door and stalked inside. Leo grabbed the big plastic garbage bag out of the back of the truck and followed his brother upstairs. The wet towels were inside. Leo felt inadequate bringing them inside for Lars. Nona sat at the table, meticulously inventorying all their supplies. She pointed a finger at the various cupboards and shelves, directing Bruce to put things away after she noted them on her list. "Lars is getting worse," Nona said by way of greeting as Leo and Anton entered the cabin. "You two need to run back down to the farm. There's a leftover bottle of penicillin in the bathroom cabinet from when your dad got sick last spring." For a split second, her eyes clouded with worry. "The poison in the back of his neck is spreading. If the penicillin doesn't work, I may need to lance the infected area." Leo felt his muscles tense with alarm. His grandmother wouldn't think of sending them back to the farm if things weren't desperate. The bag of towels in his hand felt like a joke. "Go now," Nona ordered. "While you're down there, clean out all food and supplies before the Russians show up and take everything. Otherwise, with the way you boys eat, we'll be out of food in a little over a week. If anything looks amiss, turn around and come back. Here, I've made you a list. The Russians will hopefully be too busy in the towns today to bother with our farm." Leo took the list before turning to Bruce. "Nup for a supply run?" "Bruce stays here to help me with Lars," Nona said. "It will be faster if Anton goes with you, since you both know where everything is." Leo checked an irritated grumble. Everything Nona said made sense, but he didn't like being saddled with his entitled little brother again. "Don't worry," Anton said with an easy smile. "I'll be sure to get underfoot." He marched out of the cabin. He probably would have given Leo the middle finger if their grandmother weren't standing there. Nona gave Leo a severe scowl. "Be nice to your brother." Leo snorted and stalked out of the cabin. Be nice to your brother. Was it any wonder Anton was so cocky? He had everyone looking out for his needs. In the meantime, the farm was dying around them, and Anton did next to nothing to pull his weight. As Leo drove back down the hill with Anton, his little brother took Nona's list and ripped it in half. "What did you do that for?" Leo snapped. "Half for you, half for me." Leo was incensed. "Did you even look at the list before you did that? We should split it up by area, not just tear it in half." Anton rolled his eyes. "You're overthinking it. Our house isn't that big, man." As much as Leo wanted to argue the point, it wouldn't help anything right now. He and Anton would be more efficient if they weren't arguing. When they were less than a mile away from their house, he stopped the truck and got out. "What are you doing?" Leo ignored his little brother, pulling out the binoculars he'd grabbed on the way out of the cabin. He climbed onto a large rock outcropping, which gave him an unobstructed view of the farm. He scanned the orchard for any sign of Russians. Nothing moved among the apple trees. He skimmed past the orchard to the barn. Nothing looked out of place there either. Lastly, he studied the house. Everything was as they had left it, even down to the skid marks from his father's truck when he left to find Lena and Dal. Anton joined him on the outcropping. "Can I see?" "In a minute." Leo was checking the highway leading to the farm. It was clear. No Soviets anywhere. Nor was there any sign of his dad, Lena, and Dal. Leo passed Anton the binoculars. "It's clear. Come on, we can drive down." Leo had been prepared to leave the truck behind and go on foot if necessary. They wouldn't have been able to get food supplies, but they could have gotten the penicillin. The rest of the drive passed in silence. Anton was out the door before Leo could turn off the engine. By the time Leo got into the house, Anton was in the living room with the television on. "What are you doing?" Leo snapped. "We didn't come down here so you could watch your favorite show. For your information, I was checking to see if there was any news." Anton glared at him. "What's with you?" You're always on my case. Nothing I do is good enough. You need to grow up." Anton's face turned red. "Just because you're pissed off about losing your football scholarship doesn't give you the right to be such an asshole all the time. I'm sorry you're not at Berkeley playing ball, okay? I'm sorry your shoulder got fucked up. No wonder Jennifer dumped you. Who'd want to be with a dickwad every damn day?" Mentioning Jennifer was like throwing a gas can onto a fire. Leo's temper detonated. "Do you know how much debt Dad is in?" he roared. "He leveraged everything to pay for Mom's chemo. Everything. We could have lost the house and farm if I didn't stay and do something." Leo stormed out of the room. He was so angry he could hardly read the crumpled list in his fist. He stomped into the bathroom and rifled through drawers until he found the penicillin. Shoving it into his shirt pocket, he stalked toward the utility room to grab some empty boxes and garbage bags. Anton had left the television on in the living room. It let out that awful blare and displayed the emergency broadcast system's color bars. Leo switched it off. Apparently, there was still no news. Dal's single broadcast from the radio station was the only hint of the Russian invasion taking place 10 miles down the road. The closet outside the bathroom held all the extra blankets and towels. Sticking to Nona's list, he shoved them into the garbage bags. As he did, he caught sight of his father's small desk inside the master bedroom. On the desk was a small bill organizer stuffed full of paperwork. All the fight went out of him. How he wished he'd never snooped in his father's private things. How he wished he could turn back the clock to a time when he was as oblivious as Anton. To a time when grappling with the enormity of Mom's illness had been the only worry on his list. He shouldn't be such a dick to Anton. No one made him fake the shoulder injury. No one made him walk away from his dream of playing football. A scream punched through his eardrums. Leo reacted on instinct. He dropped the bag of blankets and raced onto the front porch. Anton was already there, rifle gripped in his hands. Someone screamed a second time. It came from the east, from the Granger family farm. Anton and Leo exchanged looks. In wordless agreement, they hurried to the fence line that separated their two properties. If there were Soviets on the Granger farm, they were fucked. They'd have to ditch the truck and make their way back to the cabin on foot or risk drawing attention to themselves. Leo and Anton crouched low and crept through the tall grass that grew near the fencing. When they reached the chain-link fence that separated their properties, they dropped to their knees and raised their rifles. The screaming gained intensity, and it was coming closer. The muscles of Leo's back tightened. He scanned the Granger orchard, finger light on the trigger. He didn't like Mr. and Mrs. Granger. In fact, most days he thought they deserved to be hit by lightning. But he wouldn't let them be hunted down by Russians. Not even they deserved that. The dark head of Mrs. Granger appeared. She was wearing her customary orchard clothing, jeans and a flannel shirt. Except one sleeve of her shirt had been torn off. She was bleeding all up and down her arm. There was also a tear in one leg of her jeans. She ran through the trees. Mr. Granger pursued her, a guttural growl rumbling up from his throat. It sent a chill across Leo's shoulders. Mr. Granger charged after his wife like a lion after a gazelle. Leo had never seen the man move like that. He must be more pissed off than usual, or maybe more drunk than usual. Both scenarios were feasible. The guy was a royal dick. Mrs. Granger never stopped screaming. She spoke no words, only screamed. That wasn't unusual either. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the windows open, Leo could hear the two of them going at it. Mr. Granger was usually yelling. Mrs. Granger was always screaming. That was why, when Dal moved in with them freshman year, he hadn't argued when his friend offered to sleep in the utility room. He didn't want Dal to have to listen to his crazy parents go at each other. The utility room was on the far side of the house, opposite to the Granger farm. If Dal could hear his parents over there, he'd never spoken of it. Leo and Anton watched the two continue to dodge through the apple orchard. "Does Mr. Granger have blood on his face?" Anton asked. Leo had noticed that. "Yeah, he does. Do you think she actually fought back this time?" Leo shook his head. "I think Mr. Granger bit her. That's why her shirt is torn." "Bit her?" Anton's brow furrowed. "You really think so?" "It wouldn't be the most fucked up thing he's done to her." Anton couldn't argue with that. Over the years, they'd seen Mrs. Granger with a broken arm, dislocated shoulder, broken nose, and cracked ribs. Biting was fairly tame in comparison. Mrs. Granger disappeared behind the barn. Mr. Granger was hard on her heels. When the couple was out of sight, the screaming went up several octaves. "God, that guy is a dick," Anton said. "Think I could get away with blaming it on the Russians if I shot him?" "He must be raging drunk." "Whatever. Like that's an excuse. What do you think?" Anton hefted the rifle. Leo shook his head. He'd learned a long time ago that interference between those two was not appreciated by either party. It had been Mrs. Granger who threw Dal out of the house for trying to protect her. "Let's get back to the house and finish packing," Leo said. "We need to get back to Lars." Let those two kill each other if that's what they wanted. After they kicked out their only son, Leo stopped caring what happened to either of them. 30 minutes later, the back of the truck was jammed full. It was dusk. Leo hefted the last box of supplies into the back. "Funny." Anton watched him with a somber look on his face. "I didn't think you could lift heavy boxes like that with your messed up shoulder." Leo ignored him, staring up the gravel road and hoping for some sign of his dad and the others. Mr. Cecchino left hours ago. He should have been back with Dal and Lena by now. "Did you ever even have a shoulder injury?" Anton asked. Leo rubbed a tired hand over his face. It had been a long day, and he'd said too much. "Let's get back to the cabin." Just as they climbed into the truck, the crunch of tires on gravel filled the air. Someone was coming down the Cecchino farm road. Chapter 15. Visitor. "That's not my truck," Leo said. He knew the sound of his beloved truck, and that wasn't it. Alarm spiked through him. Leo snatched his rifle out of the front seat and sprinted for the woodpile on the side of the house. Anton raced behind him. His little brother might irritate the shit out of him, but the kid had good instincts. The two brothers dove behind the woodpile. A plume of dust hung in the sky, kicked up by a vehicle. "Think it's Russians?" Anton propped his rifle on top of the woodpile, crouching to sight down the crosshairs. "Don't know." The hairs prickled along the back of Leo's neck. His finger tensed on the rifle trigger, ready to fire at the first sign of danger. If Russians were here for the Cecchino farm, they were in for a surprise. He'd shoot every last one of them down. He was so busy imagining a car full of Russians invading his family's property that he was completely unprepared for the white Ford Crown Victoria station wagon that rumbled into view. His mouth fell open. He nearly dropped his rifle. "Is that who I think it is?" Anton asked. Leo couldn't find words. He knew that car. He knew the owner. He'd just never expected to see either of them again. The Crown Vic pulled to a stop in front of the house. The young woman who stepped out had blonde ringlets that fell past her shoulders. Her perfectly teased bangs added an extra 3 inches to her curvy 5'5" figure. Generous breasts filled out a slinky spaghetti-strap tank that was covered with a black mesh shirt. Fingerless black gloves covered her hands. Black stirrup pants covered her perfect ass, an ass that, a few short years ago, Leo had the privilege to touch. Red heels rounded out the outfit. Only Jennifer Miola could make a Russian invasion look good. And even while he took note of how stunning she was, he distantly registered something different about her. Like the light shining from the former cheerleader and gymnastics star was slightly off hue. He couldn't put his finger on it, though it likely had something to do with the communist invasion. Leo didn't let the thought linger for deeper study. He was too busy grappling with the resentment that threatened to choke him. Damn! Anton sat back on his heels, propping the barrel of his rifle against his shoulder. I forgot how smoking hot she is. Leo snorted in disgust. He buried his shock under a scowl and stalked out from behind the woodpile. Just to be a dick, he made it a point to aim the rifle in her direction. Leo! She jumped in surprise when she saw him. Heedless of the weapon, she rushed toward him. He was even further confused when she threw her arms around his neck. He stiffened and held her at arm's length. Leo? She frowned at him. It's me. I know who you are. What do you want? He took note of the dirt smudging the side of her face. The shoulder of her mesh shirt had a tear in it. Is that any way to greet an old friend? She gave him her prettiest smile. Once upon a time, that smile would have melted him on the spot. Today, all it did was put his hackles up. He gave her a flat stare. We have some place to be, Jennifer. What do you want? She absorbed his coldness with a long look. Her smile faded. Look, I don't know how to break this to you, but there are Russians, Anton interrupted. Jennifer blinked. You know? Yeah. Fuckers rolled right into Bastapol High. I'd probably be dead if Leo hadn't shown up and saved my ass. We have to go, Leo said. We have wounded to take care of. Wait, Jennifer grabbed his arm. Cassie is in Westville with chess club friends. I was driving there to pick her up when the Russians attacked. She fiddled with her fingerless gloves. I've been driving around for hours trying to find a way to reach her. I don't know where else to go. I need help getting my sister. And she thought her ex-boyfriend was the perfect person to help her out? Leo swallowed his anger. I can't help you, Jennifer. Like I said, we have wounded to take care of. No, wait. Jennifer refused to let go of his arm. Leo, we're talking about my baby sister. He shook her off. You're not the only one who's been separated from a family member. Jennifer blinked as his words hit her. The empathy in her eyes enraged him. Leo, I'm sorry. Look, I get it. You're scared for Cassie, but it's not safe. All the TV and radio stations are down. We have no idea what's going on. We'd be driving blind if we went out there right now. Cassie is safer wherever she is than in a car with you. Jennifer's expression melted with his every word. The confident cheerleader who'd ripped out his heart and served it to him on a platter 2 nights after senior prom now looked small, vulnerable, and scared. It didn't look good on her. He was being an epic asshole. Look. He scrubbed a hand through his hair, attempting to dial back his anger. He couldn't help Jennifer get to her sister, but he could at least give her a safe place to stay. Come to the cabin with us. You'll be safe there until the military gets here and takes care of the Russians. But what about Cassie? If things clear up, I'll help you get to her. In the meantime, we all need to lay low. But my parents... He only had so much patience for his ex. Your parents are in Bastopol, which is swarming with Russians. You can go home, or you can come with us. Make up your mind. Anton and I are leaving. He turned his back and marched to the truck, slamming the door as he climbed inside. Anton! He rapped on the driver's side door. Time to go. Anton climbed into the truck. You're being a dick, man. She's scared. Leo knew it. It had been over 2 years. You'd think he'd be over it. He wasn't. You coming? He asked Jennifer. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then scrambled into the cab beside Anton. I don't suppose you have another pair of shoes? Leo asked her as he fired up the engine. Stilettos aren't conducive for the forest life. My suitcase with all my stuff is at my parents'. I'm only here for the weekend. No shoes, then. Well, she would have to get used to roughing it in stilettos. Leo threw the truck into drive and roared away from the house. Chapter 16. Inhuman. Nona absorbed the arrival of Jennifer Miola with a slow blank. To Leo she said, Looks like you deviated from the list, Leonardo. Leo huffed and grabbed the first duffel out of the truck. His nerves were frayed. Jennifer's presence was like a file against his bones. Hi, Nona, Jennifer said. Nona looked her up and down. I don't suppose you brought a sensible pair of shoes? She didn't, Leo called over his shoulder as he stomped into the cabin. Bruce came out from the bunk room. Did you find the penicillin? Yeah. How are they, Lars and Adam? Adam is still asleep. Lars is... I don't know, man. I'm not a doctor, but he doesn't look good. Bruce's voice dropped. The Russian poison is spreading fast. He has black veins all over his face and neck. It's really fucking creepy. Nona made me give him another aspirin, but he's burning up and sweating buckets. Those wet towels didn't do a damn thing to help him. Damn it. Leo didn't have the slightest idea of what to do. He tried to sound confident for Bruce's sake. The penicillin will help. We have a shitload of stuff in the truck. Help us bring it in? Back outside, Leo was shocked when he found Jennifer on the ground with a large garbage bag of blankets slung over her shoulder. She gave him an airy look before climbing up the cabin steps in her red stilettos. Somehow, she made walking in those things look easy. Nona, I have the penicillin. Leo pulled the bottle out of his shirt pocket and handed it to her. Good. You can help me administer it to him. He's a heavy patient. Nona joined him as they climbed back up the stairs into the cabin. She leaned close to speak into his ear. What's she doing here? Nona was not a person to cross. She ceased liking Jennifer the moment she dumped her oldest grandson. She couldn't get home. Believe me, if I wasn't worried about her getting shot by a Russian, I'd have left her. It's no worse than she deserves. And now we have to share our supplies with her? I don't like it." For some reason, Nona's iciness toward his ex made her presence more tolerable. "I'll take Anton hunting tomorrow. We'll have plenty of supplies. Besides, how long could the Russians realistically hold out? 3 days, maybe. A week at the most. The United States would kick their Soviet asses back across the ocean. They just had to hold out in the cabin until that happened." "She has to pull her weight," Nona said. "There's work to be done." Leo nodded. Jennifer wasn't lazy. She'd graduated with a 3.8. Besides being captain of the cheerleading squad, she'd been a competitive gymnast and president of the Kiwanis Club. All that hard work had earned her a scholarship to UC Riverside in Southern California. Idleness was Jennifer's archenemy. Leo knew she'd be up for whatever work needed doing, even if all she had was a pair of stilettos. Leo and Nona entered the cabin when a high-pitched scream broke out. It was coming from inside the room. The sound was unlike anything Leo had ever heard before. It seemed like the very walls of the cabin might shred under the force of it. Leo sprinted past Nona toward the room. Bruce and Anton dropped the boxes they were carrying and raced after him. The three of them burst into the bunk room. The scene before them stole the breath from Leo's lungs. "The fuck?" Anton cried. Adam was pinned to the floor by Lars. Lars had one hand around Adam's neck. His other hand pinned his pelvis. His teeth were buried in Adam's neck, blood leaking across Adam's shoulder and gushing across the floor. "What the fuck?" Anton cried again. Lars looked up. His mouth and teeth were bloody. Adam flailed, but Lars kept him pinned in place. Even though Bruce had warned him, Leo could hardly believe what he was seeing. In the hour and a half since they'd been gone, Lars's entire face and neck had become covered with a webbing of black veins. His eyes were shot through with blood. An inhuman snarl rippled out of Lars's throat. Bloodshot eyes shifted, taking in Leo and the other two boys. He growled again. It was an animalistic sound, a warning to stay away. Like Adam was a fucking deer and Lars was a lion. "Help me," Adam said weakly. "Help." The chaos of the moment kick-started Leo's brain. He'd always been good under pressure. He shoved Anton aside and charged. A boot to the face sent Lars sprawling across the floor. "Anton and Bruce, help Adam." Leo kept his eyes on Lars, readying himself to square off against the bigger kid. Lars bounded to his feet. He barked like a rabid coyote and charged. Leo grabbed a pillow from the bed and shoved it at Lars, blocking the bloody teeth that snapped at him. The bloodshot eyes of the big teenager locked on Leo. They were crazed and filled with an animalistic frenzy. There was no sign of humanity in them. There was no sign of Lars. He snarled and growled, fighting to reach Leo. The bloodlust in his eyes sent fear into Leo. He planted a foot in Lars's stomach and sent him crashing up against the far wall. He abruptly knew only one of them was getting out of this room alive. The realization flashed through him. Feeling as though he was in an alternate, really fucked up dimension, Leo pulled out the pocket knife he always carried and flipped up the 5-inch blade. Lars had barely hit the wall on the far side of the room before he bounded back to his feet. With a howl, he charged at Leo yet again. Leo braced himself, knife raised to meet the rush. The distance between them evaporated. Leo waited until the last second before pivoting. He buried his knife in Lars's ribcage. The strike didn't even slow him down. If anything, it just enraged him. Lars ran into the wall, spun around, and rushed Leo once again. What the fuck? The blast of a rifle cracked through the room. 2 shots tore into Lars. The first shot hit him in the back. The second one pierced his heart. Lars moaned and collapsed to the floor. Blood spilled out of his body. He didn't move. Nona stood in the doorway, rifle gripped in her slim hands. "Rest in peace, poor boy." Her eyes flicked to Leo. "You okay?" Leo nodded, unable to find his voice. He'd seen his death painted in Lars's crazed face. Blood pounded in his ears. "Thanks, Nona. No one hurts my grandson on my watch." She turned on her heel and left the room. Leo licked dry lips, taking a moment to steady himself. Then he stepped over Lars's body and followed Nona into the main room. He found Bruce and Anton yelling at one another, both of them crouched over Adam's body as they tried to staunch the blood gushing out of his neck. "Get me another towel," Anton cried. "There are no more towels, man. You're not pressing in the right spot." "Then find some gauze or paper towels or something." Adam was sprawled on his back in the middle of the floor. There was a thick trail of blood smeared all the way from the bunk room. The floor beneath Adam was drenched in more blood. Leo took one look at Adam and knew the other boy was dead. Lars had torn open an artery. Anton and Bruce had fallen silent. Bruce looked like someone had hit him over the head with a 2x4. Anton scrubbed at his eyes, not quite able to look at his friend. Jennifer hovered near the kitchen. She kept opening her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. She looked stuck somewhere between shock and hysteria. 2 years ago, he would have gathered her in his arms and comforted her. No one spoke. The silence was oppressive. Somewhere outside, a crow cawed. How had this happened? How had they lost 2 friends in a matter of minutes? It could all be traced back to the Russians. This was their fault. Their poison had turned Lars into a homicidal maniac. "They need to be buried." Nona was the first one to speak. "Antony, go get the shovels." Anton responded to Nona's voice only out of a lifetime of habit. He moved woodenly, thumping down the front steps to the tool shed underneath the cabin. "Leonardo, Bruce," Nona gestured to them, "get Lars." Leo's stomach felt like lead. He headed back into the bunk room, pausing in the doorway to stare at Lars's body. The only dead body he'd ever seen was his mother's. But that wasn't the same thing. She'd been sick. Lars's death was murder. Nona might have put him down, but his death sentence had been issued by the Soviets. Leo felt something inside him shift. What had he been thinking? He couldn't just sit around in the cabin waiting to be rescued. These invaders were in his home. They were killing his friends. He had to do something about it. "I'm going to get those assholes, Lars," he said softly. "I promise." He stepped all the way into the room and grabbed Lars by the wrists. Bruce entered the bunk room, eyes glazed. He grabbed Lars by the ankles. Together, he and Leo carried the body outside. Nona found a small clearing 50 yards away from the cabin. It took the boys over an hour to dig a grave for Lars. Even Jennifer pitched in, digging for a while in her red stilettos. By the time they finished, the shadows were long, and they still had to bury Adam. They trekked in silence back to the cabin. Leo felt numb, his brain still trying to process the events that had led to them losing the 2 varsity football players. His feet clomped heavily on the wooden stairs as he led the way back into the cabin. As he reached the doorway, a long growl ripped through the room. He blinked in alarm, raising his chin just in time to see Adam sit up.
If you're enjoying Zommunist Invasion, be sure to sign up for the VIP bunker. Inside, you'll find an exclusive Zommunist Invasion origin story not available anywhere else. You can join the bunker by heading over to my website at www.camillepicott.com. Thanks so much!